You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your canine host, Abraham.
And I'm your olfactory host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We like to talk about the things that humans do, and sometimes we talk about what animals do. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. This should be a fun one. We're talking about man's best friend, humankind's best friend, we should say, historically speaking. And that is the next species that we find so commonly in our homes, the beautiful and wonderful dog.
The most wonderful of animals, I would say, and related animals. I mean, I think raccoons are cool and bears are nice, but I definitely prefer a dog if I had the choice.
And to be fair, I have mostly had cats, and I love cats, and I love dogs, and I don't think you need to be a cat person or a dog person. We're just pet-loving people.
Yeah, you're allowed to be an animal-loving person, and that's totally okay. But these animals that we're going to talk about today, these dogs are super-powered, right?
Yes. Very special, very important, unique even among the unique.
Yes.
Which is to say, specially trained dogs that do awesome things.
Yes, this is such a fascinating thing. So before we start, if you are unsure of what a seizure is, which I think some people have a general idea of what that is, we recommend going to listen to our episode 123, which talks about seizure disorders and what they do and how they work and stuff like that. So I think that'll give you a nice background to kind of lead into this discussion a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to. It's not a requirement, but it might give you some more information.
That honestly may have been where we came up with the idea for this topic originally. Now, that episode came out at the end of September 2019, if you're looking for it. And we do unpack seizure disorders more generally, as you said. But I think that we sort of mentioned we should talk about seizure dogs at some point. And by gosh, 2 years and some change, almost 2.5 years later, here we are.
The wheel of time grinds on,
Indeed. All right. Well, in addition to the fact that we already know what we're talking about today, there are some things to acknowledge. The fact that this episode is going to be coming out on March 15th, and every day is a holiday if you look at it. But there's some specific holidays that we'll like to acknowledge while we're here. And the first one I'm going to throw out is that it is the AAPI Women's Equal Pay Day. Just one day, but it's the day of equal pay.
It's the day. Yeah. It's also Brutus Day. And coincidentally, it's also Kitchen Knifeware Day.
I had to look this up. So Brutus Day has to do with, of course, Brutus being the betrayer in Julius Caesar. But the day is suggested for celebration as pruning people from your life who are those people that you don't really need in your life. And maybe the backstabbing friends.
What a horrible way to label that.
Yeah. So weird holiday, but apparently it's a thing.
Yeah, also it's not Kitchen Knife Day, just to be clear. That was a bad joke about Brutus stabbing Caesar.
Oh, got it. I actually did not look ahead to see if it was that literal day, and I thought you were just tying two things together.
Nope, I'm just being insensitive.
That would have been ironic. Or coincidental, not ironic. Anyway, it's also Buzzards Day, so hey, buzzards are cool.
Yeah, it's also True Confessions Day, so as opposed to false confessions, which are not a good thing.
We've also done an episode on that.
Uh-huh.
It is the Ides of March. Speaking of Shakespeare, probably has something to do with why it's also Brutus Day, but yeah, Ides of March.
Yeah, it's also International Day Against Police Brutality, so I think we should probably have a whole year of that, but day is a start, I guess?
I agree. I think it should be the year of against police brutality. Decade, century, millennia, maybe.
Yeah.
Any amount of time.
Entirety of humanity.
Yeah.
Entirety of any sentient species, yeah.
From now until the end of time. It is National Everything You Think Is Wrong Day, so go forth in doubt.
Joke's on you. I always think everything I think is wrong, so. It's National Peanut Lovers Day as well, so again, big fans. We support this. We like this.
Yeah, it was recently Peanut Butter Lovers Day or something, and a week ago when we did our last episode, or 2 weeks ago. I don't know. So we're just gonna acknowledge that every day we celebrate peanuts in one way or another, I suppose.
I'm assuming March is just peanut month at this point in time.
I think you're right. Yeah. Sorry, people with peanut allergies, but you stay away from peanuts. The rest of us will go toward the peanuts.
Yeah, we'll help get rid of them for you.
Exactly. It is Brain Awareness Week, which makes a lot of sense with our current topic, actually.
Yeah, and also our entire podcast, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's also Girl Scout Week, so go grab cookies if that's your sort of thing.
Support those Girl Scouts. National Science and Engineering Week, so maybe go build a rocket.
Big fan of that.
Or don't, that could be very dangerous. So
the flat earther who was trying to prove the Earth was flat and built his own rocket did not work out for him. So please be careful.
Go read about a rocket. Do that instead.
Go read about rockets, yes. Or just study Jim Parsons, who was part of the Suicide Squad that was blowing up stuff on the UCLA campus in the 60s. Like, that was a fun little time.
Oof.
By accident, not on purpose. It's also Universal Women's Week. I do appreciate that human beings are so arrogant that we make it clear that it's not national or international or global, it's universal. So, like, we have declared this Women's Week, which is important and necessary across the entire universe. So,
it is.
Whoever's on the planet of Wasp, hopefully you're enjoying Universal Women's Week.
Word. It is a social work month. So we have a whole month to acknowledge our social work friends and the work that they do for us and others.
Yeah. The incredible work that you do. It's National Reading Month. Both of us like books.
We do like books. It is importantly Disability Awareness Month, which will be followed on the heels by another specific recognition in April that we'll get to in April.
Yep. And then it's also Adopt a Rescued Guinea Pig Month.
This is an important one. I don't know why we aren't talking about this more.
The timeline of this was really pretty impressive.
Yes, go read all about it. Maybe we'll do an episode. It was a fascinating read to learn about Adopt a Rescue Guinea Pig Month. You would not think that is a place where you'd find a lot of content, and that's exactly why it stood out to me as a potentially fantastic topic for an episode, because you're like, why are they talking about this weird esoteric thing?
Yep. So expect that in 4 years, which is the timeline apparently that we're on.
Before I speak of delightful timelines, I'm going to say if you enjoy the show, you would like to support us in what we do, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch, like and subscribe, leave a rating and review, follow us and like us on the social media things, train a dog to detect seizures, and name it why we do what we do. And those are all the different ways you can support us, and I'll talk more about those at the end of this discussion. Now let's get to our timeline. So, Shane. Approximately 20,000 years ago, descendants of gray wolves were thought to be domesticated and become pets. The pets that we know and love today called dogs.
Yes, and so in 1957, along this timeline, rabies drives Old Yeller into the warm embrace of a shotgun. Oh, poor Old Yeller. That's so sad.
Spoiler alert for that movie, and very sad. Rabies is bad.
Yeah.
Also in 1957, dogs go to space.
Yeah, just so you can follow along with like how dogs have progressed. Now, in hopefully they came back. 1980s, dogs are trained to detect seizures. So this happened. This is fairly recent in our time.
Yeah. And then in 2023, movies are still made where the dog dies, signaling humanity's lack of growth in this area, because movie makers still think for some reason we want to watch dogs dying in our movies, and they are wrong.
Yeah, they're wrong. None of us want to see that. So that brings us to the conversation about this 1980s event that happened, which is that dogs are taught to smell out and sniff out and detect specifically seizures.
They went to space first, amazingly.
They went to space first. I want to be clear.
That was easier.
Yeah, it was easier to send them to space. Do you think that they can smell seizures now because they had like a Fantastic Four moment?
That would explain it, really, if you think about it. Maybe the Dark Phoenix moment as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Something in space.
Yeah.
Unlocked their ability.
Maybe that's what it is. Maybe we just don't know enough about this. But either way, we have this beautiful thing called seizure dogs, and we should probably learn about it.
We should. Let's describe everything that we've learned. So, related to monitoring of epilepsy, described by the Mayo Clinic as a, quote, central nervous system or neurological disorder in which the brain becomes abnormal, causing seizures or periods of unusual behavior, sensations, and sometimes loss of awareness. And so this whole topic has to do with supporting people who are those who experience seizures at intervals regular enough to warrant having some process for monitoring that health event to be able to support them so they're unlikely to suffer adverse outcomes as much as possible, given the fact that it is a traumatic health event.
Seizures could be related to a number of sources, including brain infections, head injuries, a stroke or tumor, and can manifest in many ways and levels of severity. What you'll find is that seizures have a lot of different types and different outcomes and stuff like that. So it's a really complex neurological disorder, but one that, like you mentioned, is very traumatic, especially when what most people know is maybe like a grand mal seizure where somebody might fall and have tremors and stuff like that. But it can be pretty intense for folks that experience this and folks that are caregivers for folks.
Yeah, I assume you've seen a grand mal seizure before, given our line of work.
I've seen grand mal, and I've seen, interestingly, I had a learner that had petite mal seizures that we would be able to monitor pretty easily.
Okay, yeah. I've also seen both and worked with individuals who were sort of across that spectrum of the grand mal and petite mal. And I've also seen it, interestingly, and we talk about this, I think, in our seizure episode, but seizures can kind of just come out of nowhere sometimes. Like, we don't really know what the cause was, and it happens one time to a person, then they never have one again.
Right.
But I did see something like that happen where someone who had no history of seizure disorders suddenly had a seizure.
Right.
And it was a very surprising thing. This was early on. I really hadn't had any training in this yet. And so it really caught me off guard when I saw it the first time and didn't really know what to think about what was happening.
Right. It's pretty intense. It can be a pretty intense experience.
We talk about this in the episode, but just as a quick summary, what you might expect to see from someone who is having an epileptic seizure, it can range from symptoms varying from temporary disorientation and confusion to them physically convulsing, laying on the ground, losing consciousness. You might see eyes roll back in the head, that sort of thing. It can span the spectrum of unusual behavior from just seeming a little confused and out of it to a serious sort of physical convulsing reaction to it.
Right, absolutely. It manifests very differently in a lot of different people. So there is, like you mentioned, a spectrum. Now, approximately 65 million people worldwide are diagnosed with epilepsy, with about 3.4 million people in the U.S. with this medical condition, and that's a lot of people to have something going on where they could be experiencing something this intense.
That's an enormous amount of people. And with 65 million, you got to imagine then that there is an industry. There's going to be a whole group of people who work to help put together supports for individuals that have this medical condition. And so the purpose of the seizure alert animals, as we're going to talk about today in this discussion, is to both help during. They can help before. There's some amount of helping before, during, and after a seizure. And so when someone drops to the floor, the seizure alert animal might do something. They might be able to even press some kind of alert button if there is one. They might lay next to the person to try and keep them comfortable. They'll do a variety of different things we'll talk about, but it immediately made sense to have some kind of support to sort of always be there if you had someone who was at risk of having seizures.
And this is not like a new concept of having animals be some type of like service animal or support for some human need. And this is something that we have done. We've kind of always just like been like, that animal seems like they'd be helpful. Let's use it.
Right.
Whether it's for food or for using as a beast of burden or some, emotional support animals. So the idea, like, it makes sense that we would start looking at this particular ailment, which is pretty dangerous, especially if you're alone.
Yeah, certainly can be.
Right. It's having some type of support animal to be there to kind of do a few things. And especially as systems of care kind of grow and expand and get more complicated, having an animal who is smart enough, like a dog, to do these things is a pretty incredible feat, but also super, super helpful. And it's probably gone so far as to save people's lives as a result of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And although it is important to acknowledge that we're going to have some relationships with these dogs, they really are intended to be there to provide a service. So they're not really pets in the sense of a pet. And this actually reminds me of when we talked about search and rescue dogs.
Yeah.
They're really highly trained to perform very specific behaviors. And so we might think of them as a companion, but they're really not meant to necessarily fill the role of pet as much. Now, of course, the owner might have very similar feelings toward that animal that they would any other pet. But it's important to acknowledge that, like, when they're trained to do these specific things, in order to maintain the integrity of their training, there needs to be a lot of upkeep of that service and a lot of responsibilities around maintaining that pet's skills. And if you don't, like, that might be okay, but just acknowledging that they will kind of transition away from being able to provide that service if that training is not maintained.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a sheriff, and he has like a canine companion that he works with, and he'll say that, a big part of that relationship is maintaining that professional boundary and and what that service looks like. And for him, there was a certain point where he fell in love with one of the dogs, and that dog ended up retiring early and becoming part of the family as a pet for the family. They were no longer able to serve in that capacity because the guy was not willing to lose the dog.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where it was kind of like, okay, so like you mentioned, the integrity of that relationship was different. The dynamic changed. So the animal took on a different role within the family.
Right. Now, a seizure dog, you might be wondering about how long they can perform their role as a seizure dog. Apparently, they'll often be with their handler for 8 or 9 years, which is a pretty decent amount of time. And then often, sort of as you just alluded to, they'll just remain with the individual as a pet. They might transfer to another individual who is in need, but otherwise they sort of get, around a decade of one-on-one where there's support for this person, and then they kind of get to retire and be their pet, or if they can continue working, they might instead have them move over to support someone else for a little while. But that's about how long you get with them.
Yeah, so while you ponder whether or not you would like to have a service animal in your house, for whatever reason, maybe they can reach tall shelves that you can't reach, so maybe you need a support giraffe or something like that. We're going to take a quick break and listen to some ads.
Okay, so let's talk about why we even pick dogs for this task to begin with, and how do dogs do this thing? Well, the primary reasons should seem fairly obvious, which is that dogs have a lot of senses that are very highly attuned to things that we just can't detect as easily. And so what you don't necessarily know about why that would make sense for a dog is that if someone's body is nearing the point of being in a seizure or are having a seizure, they'll start to release this chemical, and the chemical will show up in their sweat, in their breath, and their urine, and it can be detected as an odor. Now, as I said, we don't have noses that are sensitive enough to detect this odor, but dogs do. And dogs are already around us. They're used to being around humans, and humans generally feel comfortable around dogs most of the time. So they actually made a really good possible animal that we know that they're easy to train. People have a good relationship with them. They have a good relationship with us, and they've got noses that are over 100 times more powerful than our noses that can detect these compounds that are very subtle, but are there.
Right. So then when you have a dog that sleeps in your bed and they sleep under your blanket and then you fart in your sleep, it's probably very upsetting for your dog. Just so you know. It's not cool, is all I'm saying. So ultimately, what we're talking about here, again, are service alert animals, seizure alert animals. And we kind of have to ask the question of what is it that they actually do? And so when you have a dog who works as a seizure dog, what they do is they help during and after the seizure. When someone drops to the floor, they can press a button related to 911. They can lay next to the person. They can provide comfort. They can do a few different things. But the big thing, and they sometimes, even beforehand, what they can do is they can help that person. They can recognize that they're about to have a seizure and get them into a safe position. And that's actually a lot of the demonstrations that I see. As a dog will come up, they'll notify somebody that they're about to have a seizure and help that person kind of lay on the floor so they don't fall and hit their head. They lay in a comfortable position so and maybe that person can alert somebody that they're about to have a seizure as well.
Yeah, and so some of the other things that they'll attend to, as we mentioned, the scent that they'll pick up, this hormone thing, is that they'll actually pick up on very subtle cues in people's behavior. And we did an episode a long time ago about Clever Hans, but this is a very similar effect to the Clever Hans effect. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with that story, a quick summary is that there was this guy who accidentally trained his horse to respond to very subtle body language from him.
Yeah.
Subtle shifts in his posture, even facial reactions potentially. This horse was picking up on very small cues, and it would basically tap its hoof to indicate a number. So it'd ask the horse to do math, and it would tap the answer to the math problem. And the horse was really just paying attention to his reaction and then was getting food rewards as an outcome of tapping correctly. Well, there's something kind of similar going on here with these dogs, except that we know that what they're attending to, and the dogs will look for sudden shifts in the owner's patterns of behavior. They'll respond by pacing, whining, licking intensely, but they will be able to identify that something is different going on with the person who is their sort of owner, handler, and they're just hyper aware of what your usual patterns of behavior are, and then what a deviation from that would look like. And so you want to look for that characteristic in the dog in the first place, that they can already be sensitive to that sort of thing.
I don't know if you've heard this. I feel like I've heard this before. So this is kind of like off the cuff, but I've heard that like a dog licking a lot is like a sign of anxiety or stress.
Oh.
That like if they're licking and licking and licking, there's like almost like a stress or a fear response. I don't know if that's true, but I think that would make sense in that paradigm if like their owner is, or like the person they're supposed to be servicing is about to have a crisis. Like it stands to reason the dog would be a little bit stressed about that.
I think that when we did our wolf trainers episode with Dr. Andrew Bulla, that they had mentioned that one of the things they look for in the wolf's behavior that indicates it might be time to stop and let them go is if they do start doing a licking thing where you sort of licking their chops and sort of like, okay, wolf is done now.
That's where I heard that from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Bulla. It was licking and yawning.
Yeah.
That's what the other one was a yawning behavior that was like, oh, things are about to go wrong.
Yeah, and they'll start to give you sort of they call them the whale eye, the sort of side look.
Mm-hmm.
The eye's sort of big, and you can see the whites.
So stressful. So you mentioned earlier this change, this scent, this thing, right?
Yeah.
And this scent that comes up, it kind of comes out in the person's sweat, is what they say, or at least they think this is what it is this chemical called menthone. And if you're kind of going, well, what is menthone? It sounds like menthol. You're not wrong. It's closely related to menthol and has like a minty type of scent to it. The reason this is important is because human beings typically don't smell like mint.
True.
Like that's not a thing that comes out of humans most of the time.
Yeah.
And so that is a stark change in the chemical makeup of a human body. And so like smelling something that is so sensitive and so specific, that it makes sense that subtle change would be enough for that person to start, or that dog to start kind of noticing that something's going wrong.
And again, it's too subtle for us to be able to detect it. And I actually read that it's even too subtle for most machines to be able to detect it. But because dogs just have so much olfactory nerves packed into their noses, their brains are well set up to receive and process olfactory nasal information. They're much better at this than even the machines we've been able to put together. Although I imagine they're working on building machines that can do this sort of thing to detect that. But yeah, so they do rely on that, and they can then train the dogs to recognize that scent that's being produced by the body when a seizure is about to occur, and then the dog can start getting into action right away.
Right. And so there's been some research with specifically physical samples taken from individuals post-seizures to test that the dogs could recognize that. I don't know what the outcome of that was, but I know they're starting to look at stuff like that.
Some of the data I found did find that they were pretty accurate. I saw as low as 67% and as high as 100% accuracy. So you have a range of like, it's better than chance responding, and it can be completely accurate in some instances.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, how would you teach a dog to do this? Kind of in the way you might think, I imagine, depending on the way that you think. It's not like Matrix where you plug it into their brain and download a software patch, but
right.
But sort of through the processes that we know work. And the two that come to mind most frequently are the classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And in classical conditioning, they'll pair that scent of that hormone with food initially during training so that the dog comes to recognize it as being important. And then the scent comes to control an emotional response from the dog by eliciting a reaction. When they sense it, they already have a response to that scent.
Such a better application of classical conditioning and emotional responding than Watson ever did.
True. And arguably Pavlov.
And Pavlov, yeah. What I'm saying here is there's way less spit and way less fear. So that's nice.
And way less drilling.
And way less drilling, which is like, didn't think that was going to come up today. The other process, and this makes sense too, is operant conditioning, right? So if you got classical conditioning to condition the response and the smell and really kind of develop that conditioned reflex, you've also got operant conditioning. And this is when that target response, whatever that target response is, the helping, the pressing, the 911, all of those things, that's trained under control of the presence of the seizure scent. So the seizure scent occurs, you teach these behaviors, you gain reward in the presence of that particular scent. So what ends up happening is generalization, or the spread of this behavior or these behaviors, is deliberately programmed or taught by ensuring the dog responds to the seizure scent from a variety of individuals, because everybody might smell differently when they're smelling minty.
Your own brand of mintiness that you might emit. Yeah, and I guess most of our listeners, I think, are clear enough and have enough contact with this that it probably doesn't warrant a huge deep dive. But just in case you're not really as big into the history and world of psychology and conditioning and behavior analysis and whatnot, I think the basic breakdown that people give for classical versus operant conditioning is that classical conditioning has to do with involuntary reflexes, like very basic, almost unconscious associations. And then on the operant conditioning side, it has to do with teaching voluntary responses and reactions to specific environmental cues.
Yeah.
And that those are then associated with some reward for performing an action, either to get out of something you don't like or to earn something you do like. There's sort of a very general breakdown of how that goes.
I typically break it down like, classical conditioning is like behavior you're born with. Like you are born, you're hardwired with certain behaviors, and then operant behavior, for the most part, operant behavior is learned, right? Like blinking is one of those exceptions where you can be like, okay, so like I can make myself blink, or I can blink because my eyes are dry and it's a response. But for the most part, that's kind of how I break it down.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
So anyway, we were talking about generalizing the skill of recognizing the scent of the menthone or whatever other compounds they might be smelling, and making sure that they recognize that in a variety of individuals. The extent to which this has been observed is not clearly depicted in the data, at least not that we found from our research. So it seems like there's probably an area for expanded research to identify the parameters of how well this is learned and applied.
Yeah, and I think given that this is fairly new research, we're talking 1980s, well after dogs went to space. And also that we're still learning about what seizures do and how they work and like brain makeup and stuff. Like, I think it makes sense that we've got like a large gap in the research there.
Yeah. So anyway, that's at least where we're coming in. The important thing now, I think, is understanding, okay, we know how they might train a dog to recognize the scent. They do this pairing, they do this teaching, this association, all of that. But what does the dog do when the scent is detected, when the change in the behavior patterns are detected? The cues are all there for the dog to do some kind of performance. What is that response? What is the performance that they do? What do they need to learn to sort of maximally help and support the person who is in their medical sort of crisis that they're experiencing?
There's a lot of behaviors that the animal can engage with. First is they could just poke their nose. We mentioned that kind of thing. They poke the nose to get the person's attention. We also mentioned guiding them to a safe and seated position. There are other things that these dogs can do too, which I think is really important.
Yeah, they'll often lay next to the individual so that they prevent any further injury, just to help keep them in sort of a safe position. They might also, I assume this depends on the size of the dog and the size of the human, but they can break the fall by getting between the handler and the floor. Again, I think there's probably situations where that's not safe for either of them, but assuming that it is safe and it makes sense, that would be an appropriate way to apply their skill.
If that were me, I would crush that dog. There's no way. I would feel so guilty. Like I would have to explicitly request that they do not train a dog to do that, because I would rather fall and hit my head than crush a dog.
Well, I was thinking if you've seen those like Great Pyrenees dogs that are essentially just polar bears and their size is about the same as a polar bear, they would be fine because you would fall against them and it'd be like hitting a fluffy wall.
That's true. I think if it were me, though, I think I'd still probably request like a seizure black bear. I feel like that's probably about the appropriate size of an animal that would catch me.
A little more expensive.
A little bit more dangerous, maybe well worth it. Also, the animal will stay with the handler until additional support arrives, which I think is really important. So there's that kind of like, from the emotional standpoint, from the person who suffered from the seizure, there's companionship, there's support, they're not feeling like the loneliness that goes along with just having a medical emergency and not knowing what's next.
And assuming that this is someone who there's enough of a worry that they anticipate that there might be a seizure, they'll often give them some kind of device. As we mentioned, there's sort of like a button that the dog could press or something. So there might be a device that's specifically created so that a trained dog can meaningfully interact with that device to either contact a loved one or some emergency personnel, maybe all of the above. Even this is sort of unrelated to seizure dogs, but a lot of the new technology that's been coming out, like Apple Watches and different phones and different watches and activity trackers that people carry, not signaling out Apple. I think Samsung has some that do this as well. Anyway, they are also designed to detect falls and crashes and to like immediately call emergency responders if something like that is detected, so that people can be on the scene more quickly. And I think there's a similar thing with these seizure dogs, is that they can call for help in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. Now, all of these responses, they get shaped up, they get trained, they get taught, they get kind of like, they move towards a terminal response. And specifically, they get rewarded once those correct responses occur. And that's done with food and some kind of reward or positive reinforcement and something like that.
Yeah.
And you see this in any sort of animal training. I mean, this is not a new technology. It's just the context in which the training is occurring is a little bit different than, let's say, you're teaching a sea lion how to do flips at SeaWorld, right? Like, it's the same principles exist, and they're all behaviors. They're just different sets of behaviors.
Yeah, the dog does not love you. It does not care whether or not you make it through this episode. It just wants the treat at the end. Totally kidding. I'm sure that the dog forms a very meaningful relationship and is actually legitimately concerned.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. But that's how they learn. They initially taught, like, they might not necessarily understand what's happening, but they're taught to, like, to at least act in the face of that, and then they might also experience some emotional things, worry and other responses that they're just going to exhibit by being around a loved someone that is a meaningful part of their life, arguably one of the only people they ever experience, at least in high doses, and so then they'll have a reaction to it. So yeah, I had to explain that joke away. It was a lot. I know the people, angry dog people are like, how dare you?
That's not true about dogs. Well, while we write better jokes, let's go ahead and take some ad breaks so we can get better without having to explain the next jokes that we tell.
All right. So those were some ads for jokes, maybe how to write jokes.
Hopefully. Clown school? Something
like that. Yeah, clown school. That's what it was. Or some comedic stand-up thing. Who knows? Anyway, what we were talking about is what a dog does when it's trained to respond to these seizures. And of course, there's another important piece of this is not only are they trained to recognize it, is that they then get a lot of repeated practice. And that's how we learn kind of anything, but definitely how these animals learn this is there's emphasis on a use of positive reinforcement and repetition. So there's a lot of learning opportunities to ensure that this response is fluent and it's immediate. And the dog doesn't have to sit there and think, wait a minute, when I was in class, they told me what to do. And I'm trying to remember, this was on the test. I know the professor mentioned this.
You don't want a dog flipping through the textbook to just be like, wait, page 57. Got it. Okay. That's like, right. You don't want that.
Bust out the manual. No, we want a fluent, rapid. They're basically EMTs. They're going to do something for us. And we want that response. So the repetition is a very critical piece.
Another thing to think about too is you might be going, well, how does this, where does this happen? And how does this happen? And who pays for this? Well, great question. Thank you for asking, Abraham. So like all good things, it costs up to $40,000 to train a single dog.
Oof.
Specifically to train a seizure alert dog. And it could take up to 2 years. So we talk about these kind of like these simple processes that take a very long time with a lot of repetition over a long period of time. Again, you're talking fluent behaviors when this stuff happens. And this is typically done through nonprofits, but there are for-profit organizations that offer different services and different pricing. And so these do exist. Again, there's an industry. When there are 65 million people that experience this particular phenomenon, there's going to be some capitalist that steps in and goes, we could do that.
Yeah.
Or some social service that could do that too.
We can make money on this.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the thing. It's the nature of the beast, if you will. But let's talk about whether or not this is real. Has science shown that this is real? Yes. But here's some empirical validation that we can talk about. So one study mentioned in medicalmutt.org.
Hold on. I appreciate that the empirical validation that we're getting from is medicalmutts.org.
That's important.
It's important. I think names matter.
And people have fun. They're having fun with their name, and that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, in this study, dogs were, quote, trained to find samples collected from patients having a seizure, end quote. And the dogs were taught to identify the seizure samples and then compared them with the same individual. And further, the dogs completed this task following diverse activities, including physical activity and resting. The dogs demonstrated this across samples from many people with different types of seizures. So they got lots of practice spanning a variety of different ways that it could present to ensure that you had a good general set of skills that were applied when and only when they were needed and not outside of that context, but also they weren't missing opportunities. And again, trying to get them as close to 100% accurate as possible. And I saw those ranges from like 67 to 100%. But I think that once they end training, they're pretty comfortable that they're going to be close to that 100% accuracy.
Right. And so additional research has suggested that a unique scent may indeed be paired with an individual having a seizure. So it might not just be the menthone that's the thing that is kind of the trigger. It might be that plus some unique pheromone or hormone smells that might come from that person. And the dog may be able to discriminate that with trained responses. So they can actually train very, very specific responses in relation to that human who's having that experience.
Now, the smell can occur in close proximity to the seizure, immediately before and during, but anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour afterward, they could also be detecting that same smell. And as you said, it seems that it can be a part of several compounds that occur during this event. And so being able to detect it as different from that individual and unique is an important skill.
Right. So essentially, just to kind of like reframe that, right? These alert dogs are taught to singularly isolate that menthone smell or that particular smell, but they're also taught so that they can generalize across multiple people, but they're also taught and can be taught to smell individual smells mixed with the menthone so they can identify their owner's smell. And that's how powerful dog noses are. They can do that, it seems like.
Super powerful, like super powered, basically.
Yeah, like dogs in space. Large-scale research is currently lacking, so it is fair to say, again, and we kind of brought this up earlier, this is a new line of research. And especially like questions that come up in the 80s are already worth questioning because you can't really figure out how much of them are cocaine-fueled research projects and how much are real because the 80s was a weird time. I mean, all you got to do is look at everybody's haircuts. But my point is that since it's new research, there's not a big body of research on it just yet. On top of that, there's not a lot of behavior analytic research on this, if there's any. And so, when we start kind of looking at this and digging in, obviously we need more support for this. But it's very promising and it's fairly consistent across the studies that have been done.
Yeah, and really the least consistency, the part where we need the most research is just that we are not really clear on when there is success, what is that is attributable to.
Right.
Like, is it they're picking up on those behaviors? Are they picking up on the scent? Is it a combination of the two? Is it they get really used to one person? Can they get used to anybody? Like, the variables that are important are not super well known, and it's not super consistent, it seems, across them. And so there's concern about the reliability and the consistency of the procedures to teach these specific target behaviors, and these need to be evaluated for additional controlled research to validate and perhaps improve procedures so that we can continue to support these people who have epilepsy or any other seizure disorder or experience with seizures and ensure that they are likely to be have the best outcome possible given that situation.
So thinking about that situation and thinking about this, I want you all to go on a journey with us and to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who might need a service alert dog like this. So this is a really horrible thing to think about, but this is kind of the context in which this is going to be a useful service, right?
This is probably, just as a quick forward, probably very on the mind of Alan, who helped us put together the notes for this, who has recently become a father. And so I think he's thinking a lot about babies. And so he came up with this horrifying scenario. And so just to have that context going into it.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for this horrifying scenario. It's one of those like infomercial horror stories. Like, it's like always like there's like it's just like the worst possible situation. So imagine this. Your dog comes running in while you're bathing your baby. The dog seems to poke at you emphatically, and you're tempted to ignore its insistent nudges, focusing on getting your baby out of the water. Seconds later, you experience a grand mal seizure, losing consciousness, and violently convulsing on the floor. Fortunately, the alert of the dog allowed you to get the baby out of the water, to get into a safe position, and to make sure that nothing more tragic happened in that scenario. Because if that seizure came on suddenly and you were not prepared, who knows what could have happened beyond that. So having that alert dog possibly save 2 lives, not just 1.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's all the prevention that we can get, all of the immediate reaction that we can get, all of that's going to increase the likelihood of a successful outcome for anybody who's involved in that situation. I can imagine another scenario where if you're someone who knows, for example, that you have a seizure disorder, you probably, if you can drive, and I know a lot of people who have seizure disorder cannot, but assuming that you can drive, you've been cleared, maybe because it's been a certain amount of time without having a seizure, you might be able to have your dog with you if you were driving and all of a sudden the dog starts reacting in the way that it's been trained to respond, then to pull over and put the car in park, get yourself in a safe place and whatnot. That might be another time to prevent what could become a very serious outcome.
Yeah.
That could harm a lot of people, including yourself.
Yeah. Or if I think of other situations like you're preparing a meal, you live in a building or live in a home where you have staircases that you might be walking up and down. Like, I think of like all these situations where like you might be going on a run. You're out in the community and you're like going for a walk or a run. Like all of these situations are, situations that somebody with a seizure disorder shouldn't have to necessarily avoid.
Yeah.
But having that safety precaution in place is necessary to make sure that something more devastating doesn't happen as a result of that.
We can help them. We have the technology.
We got it from space.
Okay, so again, just understanding sort of what's going on here with the training of the dog. I think the straightforward part of this, and this is sort of thinking like unpacking this from the sort of psychological perspective, what's going on, if you will. And we obviously approached a lot of that in just describing how the conditioning and training works. But essentially, just to break this down, I think the way that we would put this in general terms, the dog responds to stimuli that are produced during a seizure episode. Those can be both physical stimuli that they detect, such as a scent, as well as behavioral patterns or changes that they also know how to respond to, that are cues that sort of teach them what to do. And that incorporates those two elements we talked about, the classical conditioning and the operant conditioning. They recognize something that's been paired with another stimulus so that they know what that scent is, and they also respond to those cues that are sort of signal it's now time to act in this way, if you will. Almost like a command. You could think of that you sort of teach the dog to read the body language of someone who is about to go into a seizure or is in a seizure as like a non-vocal command to that dog to do something. And they learn that command. So to strengthen the response, to strengthen that skill in the dog, and make sure that they cover a very diverse array of situations, the training then specifically focuses on ensuring that they respond to cues generally and not super specifically, because we want to make sure that they can handle sort of any situation where this is likely to occur. Alan writes in here very beautifully, the more examples, the merrier. It's sort of a fun way of sort of describing it. We want them to have lots of repetition across a wide variety so they can get plenty of contact with examples and non-examples that teach them to understand when to respond and when not to respond. And of course, there might be some difficulty transitioning between their handlers, and there needs to be more work in, I think, the field of training with both behavior analysts, with psychologists, with animal trainers to help ensure that they can make that transition from one person that they're supporting to another.
I think that's beautifully said.
Thanks. Now, what does ChatGPT have to say about seizure dogs? Listen to some ads and then come back and find out. All right, so we asked ChatGPT to weigh in and just describe essentially what, this is the Terminator software here that we're all enjoying and having fun with right now.
God, we're having so much fun with this over here. Like the Why We Do What We Do team is like loving this thing right now. It's great.
It is very fun. So anyway, it's out there. It's the AI chatbot, in case you're not familiar with it, that you give it a writing prompt and it'll respond. And it's not just like Googling results, but it's actually understanding what you're asking and the meaning and returning some kind of answer. Anyway, I'm not going to read its whole description, but actually suffices to say that the ChatGPT summary mirrors very closely what we've talked about in this episode up to this point. So essentially, the robot agrees with our assessment of the process behind seizure alert dog behavior. Take that as you will, understanding that ChatGPT is also not necessarily a source of reliable information because it just creates text. It could be saying anything, but it agreed with us, so that makes us feel good. Yeah. If you would like to get full access to what ChatGPT wrote, I'm sure you could go ask it, but you can also join us on Patreon where we will be publishing the entire notes that we have for this. If you join us at a certain level, you get access to our notes behind the scene and you can see what we included in here from ChatGPT. And I might even just post it to regular Patreon members as well. Just that section of the notes just for fun.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So essentially what this said, the robot agreeing with us and kind of the thesis of this is that there is a scent that's emitted by the body prior to or during a seizure. And if there is, it stands that it can be captured and used in discrimination training, like teaching the dog to discriminate when somebody is about to or is having a seizure versus when they are not. So it's nice to kind of see that there is some information, at least like kind of on a starting point for the stimulus that, or the cue that exists, and how the dog can be taught to respond to that cue. And the robot agreed with us on that part too.
Yes. So anyway, that's kind of what we have to say about seizure alert dogs and what's going on with how they work and how they sort of help support people and what they do. And that's, I think, very cool. Mm-hmm. Some sort of take home points is that the fact that dogs can be trained to do this. They can be trained to detect these seizures and look for markers or cues that indicate this. And it can be used across a wide variety of settings. We didn't really dig into this, but they can even be used for forensics and police work. Obviously, we've mentioned a little bit police dogs and how they've been applied there. And they also, in this case, can detect oncoming seizures, responding to an individual who's having a seizure, so that there's a variety of services they might perform in that space alone. And one of the big take-homes for me is that what they're responding to is a couple of things. One is that menthone thing that can be a compound or a part of scents the body releases in sweat, breath, and in your urine. And they also can respond to those very subtle behavioral cues that are a change in your pattern of behavior. It might look a way that they've been trained to recognize as being out of characteristic.
Right. And so with the sterility of talking about what they're trained to do, how they're trained, it's important to understand what seizure dogs actually do. And so what they do is they're trained to comfort, they're trained to protect, they're trained to respond when their handler, their person, their family member, their loved one is having a seizure. That's what they're set up to do. That's what their specialized skill is. Where we have, like you mentioned before, where you have like bomb sniffing dogs and police dogs and all that stuff. There are other animals that do this too. We didn't even talk about tuberculosis rats or cancer bees, but those are also things that exist out there that are different animals that do that are specialized to do this thing. And while it's really cool and the science is there and all that, it's important that it's a life protecting, it's a healthcare service that exists as part of like ensuring that person has a good quality of life and they're safe.
You raise a good point. Another take home for me, I hadn't thought of initially, was that the reason that dogs are the ones that we chose to be involved in this process. Like, could we train cats to do this? Could we train rats to do this? Could we train a guinea pig to do this? Maybe one that you've rescued.
A rescued guinea pig?
Yeah, probably. Actually, for a lot of these, they also have extremely sensitive olfactory. But with the thing about dogs, and the reason they probably are the ones who've been included in this, is their size gives them a certain advantage in how they can interact with meaningfully and do things, so that larger animals, they can sort of help guide you somewhere. They might be able to pull you or push you in a particular direction, specifically if the dog is large enough. The other creatures that we mentioned don't get very large, at least not large enough to do some of that. And in addition, we already have a good relationship with these animals. Mm-hmm. So like there's a good support that they can provide there, and they're pretty easy to train. We know that just basic food rewards are a very simple way to guide their behavior. So I think that's the reason that we landed on dogs. Although other animals could provide this specific service, dogs were, I think, uniquely suited to be a really good candidate for being involved in this training process.
Right. Absolutely. Another take-home point that we've got to hit on is that we have to kind of ask the question of to what extent this is a reliable effect that can be trained and maintained across different animals and owners, but we can assume that it would be. We just need more science. Well, a lot of kind of the stuff that we're talking about needs more empirical validation. It needs to be scrutinized a little bit more because there is just not enough research.
Yeah.
And that's just a core issue with any sort of new research question that comes up. Is it's great that it's there. It seems like it's useful. And like you mentioned before, it's less about whether it does work, it's how it works. It's the mechanism by which it works. It's the active ingredient that we don't know enough about. And that's what we need more research on more than anything.
Yeah. Could we make it better? Could we make it generalized more? Could we streamline the training process for these dogs? Could we do something that we also teach the people who are handlers of these dogs to even help themselves a little bit? Is there a way that we can teach people to do other things and I'm sure that this is already part of it. Like they probably receive some training from a medical professional about how should you respond if you have any cues whatsoever that you're about to have a seizure. There's all this additional research that I think could help create a very fruitful line of investigation that has really real world consequences in helping people who are find themselves in a medical crisis seemingly out of nowhere.
Yep, absolutely. 100%.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have to say about seizure alert dogs right now. Do you have anything else before we do some recommendations?
The only thing I would add, and I said this before the show started, and I will say it again, dogs are cool. Seizure dogs are cool. We like those.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yes.
With that sentiment, let's give some recommendations.
Recommendations.
As a constant reader, I've always got a book in hand somewhere, or there's a book within arm's reach anywhere in my house. It's at any point in time. If I am literally, I could be walking down the hallway and I could probably reach out and grab a book because I just love books so much. And I am currently reading
Nice.
The Stand by Stephen King. I am loving this book so far. I'm about halfway through. By the way, this is his largest work.
Have you not read it before?
No, I've never read it before. I've never watched the miniseries. The beauty of this, and the part of the reason why I'm enjoying this so much, is the only thing I know is that there is a direct tie-in to Dark Tower from one particular book, and that's it.
Oh.
And it's kind of interesting. Like, there's a specific reference in Dark Tower to this world that he has built.
Got it.
And then there's a character, and I'll say that. I've never read it. I've never seen the miniseries, both the miniseries that came out. So I literally am going into this spoiler free,
Okay.
which is kind of shocking because this book has been out since the 70s.
Yeah.
And the miniseries came out in the 80s and in 2020. And I just am really loving it. I mean, it's a reminder that for those people who have not read Stephen King, who think he's just a horror writer, it's a reminder that he's not a horror writer. Like that's not his shtick. His shtick is that he does that well, but he writes humans well. And reading The Stand in a post-COVID, not post-COVID, but post-COVID event era is eerie.
Wow.
It's really eerie because you're kind of like, oh yeah, humans are going to make a lot of mistakes because they're going to be gullible or kind of blow it off. And then, we're lucky that it wasn't worse like The Stand and Captain Trips, but it's great. I am just absolutely loving it.
Interesting. All right. Well, I do have a collection of Stephen King books that I need to read, and I will put that on the list because I've enjoyed most of what I have read by Stephen King. There's only one book that I think I would not recommend, and for fear of retribution from all the King fans, I won't list what that book is. Suffice it to say that there's one, and I like everything else.
I want to know what it is now. You can't leave me hanging like that.
How about this? I will tell you off air, and I will tell our Patreon supporters, and if you want to find out, you can join us there.
That sounds good. I like that.
All right, I'm recommending a very new Netflix movie. It's just sort of a silly, very fun movie. It has heart and it's funny and it is enjoyable. It's called We Have a Ghost. This is largely starring Anthony Mackie and David Harbour and a slew of other people, and a bunch of kids that I don't know well enough because they're sort of new in the acting world. Although one of them was on, I want to say, Stranger Things. Anyway, We Have a Ghost. It's kind of what it sounds like. It's actually just a very different take on the idea of like a ghost story. I'd say it's more, I don't know, it's sort of comedy, sort of adventure, sort of action, sort of supernatural.
Yeah.
Sort of mystery in a way. I'll say once they find the ghost, a large amount of the movie time is spent trying to determine who that person was and how they died, because they can't communicate directly. They can't say anything.
Okay.
And so I'll leave it at that. I found it really enjoyable, so I'm recommending the movie We Have a Ghost.
I love that. That's so great.
All right. Well, if you'd like to tell us anything we got wrong or right or left out, or like to celebrate the awesome job we did talking about seizure alert dogs, we'd love to hear that sort of stuff. Reach out to us. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com, and also on all the social media platforms. If you would like to support us, you can join us over on Patreon. You can pick up some merch. You can leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so that you catch everyone. Just click that 5 stars. Helps us, show up in more people's feed, and it just, it gets us out there, which we super appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of joining us on Patreon, when you do that, you get all the benefits that we've mentioned. We're going to start a little campaign and see how this goes. We'd like to see if we can build up our Patreon audience to 15 supporting members on Patreon. And if we get up to that number within, I don't know, let's say a few months of when this episode comes out. So maybe June or something like that, end of June. If we get 15 Patreon members by or before then, we'd like to host sort of a virtual hangout where we'll jump on with our Patreon members on a Facebook hangout or a Zoom meeting or something, and we'll just talk. We'll just meet you guys. We'll have conversations, let everyone sort of chime in and say what they want to say. And then if we go beyond that 15 and we hit 20 Patreon members, we're going to plan another similar event, but one that's got more going on, that we'll do something fun, like maybe a trivia or something. So
yeah.
Anyway, if you'd like to be part of that, you can join us over on patreon.com. Look for WWD podcast. You should be able to find us there. And then you get all these other perks and stuff. You get to hang out with us, but you also get early access to episodes and that sort of thing. The people who have already done that, and thank you so much for your continued support and being awesome, and couldn't be doing all of this without you. That includes Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Kelly, Kim, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, and Stephanie. Thank you so much for continuing to stick with us and support us in all the things that we do.
Absolutely. We love y'all.
Yes, I'd also like to say thank you so much for our listeners for joining us today. Thank you to the Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group for the support that they have provided to the show. And thank you, of course, to my team. Thank you, Alan, for putting together the notes for this discussion today and all the work that he did. Thank you, Jess, Patrick, Selena, and of course, our Mixmaster General, Justin, without whom we could not necessarily have a sound that was worth listening to. He really helps bring this whole thing together. And then, of course, Shane, thank you for recording with me today, as always, buddy.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Always so much fun. All right, that was a long outro. Thank you all for listening. Is there anything else that I missed?
Nope. That's it.
All right. Perfect. Then this is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.